thank you for coming on the podcast. First of all, I was just hoping you'd tell me a little bit about yourself and how you became an artist.
My name is Jonathon Keats, and I am an experimental philosopher and an artist, although only really accidentally. I studied philosophy in school and fled as soon as I possibly could because I recognized that what I thought I would be doing, which basically was being Socrates, is
Hmm.
not in fact what you do in an academic setting when you're studying philosophy,
Mm-hmm.
and where you have a very particular tradition that you're working in, and methodology and a language that you're using that doesn't really allow for much conversation outside of academia,
Mm.
and also doesn't really allow for a very varied or very relevant, I think, in certain respects, a very relevant discourse about the issues that we're contending with today. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that they need to involve these conversations, that is, need to involve everybody, and they need to involve everybody in ways that are accessible and are open in terms of what meaning might be made. They really need to
Mm-hmm.
be a conversation. And so the accidental part was that I needed to figure out where to go with these big ideas or these notions that I had. And since clearly academia was not the space in which to be able to do philosophy as I thought philosophy needed to be done,
Mm-hmm.
I simply found the ultimate no man's land. And I think that that's probably the best description that I can give for the art world,
Mm-hmm.
because ever since, well, I mean, iconically, ever since Marcel Duchamp brought a urinal into the context of an art exhibition,
Mm-hmm.
it really has been a state in which anything goes. And
Sure.
that has probably been one of the greatest acts, and therefore one of the most significant enlargements of what art can be and what it can do. But it also has led to a lot of confusion. And as a result, it means that you can do more than simply bring more urinals into more exhibitions, which unfortunately has been largely the response to the Duchampian turn. It seems like there's been a lot squandered on the open invitation
Mm-hmm.
to do more with art than to make paintings of pretty landscapes. And I have
Sure.
nothing against a painting or a pretty landscape for that matter. We don't have enough pretty landscapes left. And
That's true.
painting is still as interesting as it ever was. It's continually renewed. But it also the art world is a space where you can do a lot of other things. And
Mm-hmm.
so I found that I could take from philosophy some of the ideas that I was interested in, and I could also smuggle out some of the methods.
Mm.
And to give an example of this, probably the most important of these was the thought experiment. And this is how
Yeah.
I've come to call myself an experimental philosopher, which, by the way, is a job title that conveniently doesn't exist out in the world. And therefore, I can just make of it whatever I want.
Smart.
There actually was, once upon a time, there were natural philosophers. This was the word
Right.
used for scientists before they were scientists. An experimental philosopher was occasionally used as an alternative to that, but
Mm-hmm.
it's relatively unoccupied territory and therefore optimal for self-definition.
Okay.
So the thought experiment is basically a counterfactual that you posit in order
Mm-hmm.
to make an argument, essentially by bamboozling your opponent into agreeing with what you set out to prove in the first place. It's a rhetorical turn, a rhetorical
Sure.
tool, but I think, has a lot more potential than that,
Mm-hmm.
because it's basically in terms of starting with a counterfactual and then in the classic way that a thought experiment is used, showing that that position is untenable, that it's absurd,
Mm-hmm.
therefore that the position that the philosopher had up his or her sleeve was actually the position that was meant to be accepted by all from the very outset,
Right.
and that everybody has to go along with it because anything else would be absurd. Instead of
Mm-hmm.
going through that, which would require, first of all, that I actually knew something, which I don't claim to. And in
Mm.
fact, I'm much more interested in the questions than in the answers. And the answers are interesting to me mostly for the fact that they generate newer and better and bigger questions.
Mm-hmm.
But the thought experiment could be used quite literally as an experiment for a possible world that could be inhabited by people, and that we could inhabit that together and have a conversation within it or interact within it in ways that would reveal the workings of the world that we know today, and might potentially reveal both oversights or blind spots, and also could potentially, in terms of that alternative world, could reveal that there are attributes of that alternative reality that are desirable or that are the opposite, that are to be avoided, and therefore
Mm.
could be a means by which to think about the future in relation to the familiar,
Mm-hmm.
and do so in a way that anybody could interact. So, in a sense, it's like sci-fi, only without any real narrative. That in the case of a sci-fi film or a novel, you're being sent through a story. And yes, there's choose your own adventure, which somewhat upsets that, but still, there are basic ways in which you are being transported. And the idea that I have had all along was that the thought experiment could be genuinely experimental, and that
Mm-hmm.
that would have a certain kinship to science fiction, which is to say, really, to all fiction, and really going all the way back to the fable, to folklore, but that it could do something different. And that's what I've been doing ever since. And I've been using, or abusing perhaps, the art world for
Sure.
purposes of doing this sort of work,
Okay.
if you can call it work. And I think that it's play really more than it is work.
Mm-hmm.
But I've been doing so also outside of the art world. And so at the same time that I accept the title of artist, and I deeply respect people who are artists,
Mm.
I don't know that I am one, and I don't know that I really want to be one,
Okay.
because to me, there are great advantages out of the completely confused state of the art world that allow for me to do a lot of things that there's just no other place in the world for them. But on the
Mm.
other hand, the art world sets certain expectations, and it also has a certain threshold that it places in terms of, there are a lot of people who just don't think that they can understand art. There are a lot of people who just won't
Right.
walk into a museum, or won't accept art as something that is relevant to their lives, either that it
Mm.
is frivolous, that it's entertainment, in other words, or on the contrary, that it's too serious and too stultifying. And I don't
Sure.
really want either of those qualities to adhere to what I do. So
Mm.
the art world gives a certain sort of space in which to explore and experiment, and gives a certain sort of leverage, but it also, I think, ultimately, like Wittgenstein's famous ladder, needs to
Mm.
be kicked away ultimately. And of course, that means that I end up stumbling and falling flat on my face.
Great introduction. Awesome. I mean, and I think too, philosophy is like that for a lot of people as well, which I think probably gets a little bit at what you were saying at the beginning of why you ran from philosophy, if I'm correct in that assumption.
Yeah, I think that philosophy and art have a lot in common and a lot to answer for, as far as the fact that both of them seem to me to have come out of fundamentally popular activities. That is
Mm.
to say, that they became rarefied through a sort of self reinforcing mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
That, in the case of art, basically, if you look at art up through the 19th century, and
Mm-hmm.
you're really fast and loose with the facts, but nevertheless, the trends are, I think that they map on pretty well. And I spend a lot of time in the art world. Another part
Right.
of what I do is that I am an art critic, so I'm constantly
Okay.
thinking about and writing about art. And as I said earlier, I'm really deeply respectful of and interested in art. But basically,
Mm-hmm.
what happened was that up through the 19th century, you had a sort of reinforcement of certain genres and techniques,
Right.
basically the effect of what guilds have done in, or what guilds did in the crafts.
Mm-hmm.
And for the most part, the arts were craft in terms of their basis. So it became something that was very specialized in terms of who could do it. But still, it remained for a long span of that time
Mm-hmm.
fundamentally in the service, for instance, of the church, where you couldn't be too obscure, or I don't know whether you get excommunicated for it, but you
Yeah.
certainly would not be doing much good in terms of the propagandistic qualities.
Sure.
And while the propagandistic qualities are really problematic,
Mm-hmm.
I think that first of all, a lot of artists subverted them, even in the course of
Yeah, totally.
seemingly adhering to them. But also, there was a way in which this was accessible. You had the Bible in Latin, and I don't
Mm-hmm.
mean to end up in some territory of religious discourse here, but very briefly, you
Mm-hmm.
have you have you have the pauper's Bible that is as a tradition, and the stained glass window as well as a tradition, both coexistent with a Bible that is inscrutable
Mm.
to most
Yeah.
people. So so I think that with art, then you end up with this turn toward a an insecurity
Mm.
that comes from the de-skilling that is the Duchampian turn I referred to earlier,
Right.
that results in the need for self-justification.
Mm.
And that leads to an academic, not academic in the sense that art was academic in previous centuries, but a different sort of academic approach where it basically is a barricade. And
Yeah.
I think that philosophy also has had that sort of insecurity in terms of the fact that, you know, anybody can talk about ideas.
Right.
So, what happens when you think about the history and when you think about the present case of the academy?
Mm.
When you think about the university, how does the university differentiate itself? How do philosophers in the university differentiate themselves?
Mm-hmm.
So part of this is, I think, equivalent to in the sciences, where you have a genuine need for methodology to become more and more complex in order to be
Mm-hmm.
able to operate in terms of what has come before, and also a body of knowledge that becomes increasingly rich and increasingly voluminous.
Yeah.
But these also are limiting factors in
Mm.
terms of the fact that then it becomes specialized, both
Mm.
out of, I think, intentional sort of a sort of intentionality on the part of a self-protective maneuver, but also
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the sheer weight, the sheer scale of this body of knowledge, and it ends up ossifying. So
Mm.
I guess this is all a very long-winded way of saying that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to figure out how to avoid all of that while sort of helping myself to as much of it as possible.
Yeah.
How do I take that those legacies? How do I take all the thought that has come before me
Mm-hmm.
and play fast and loose with it? How do I do that in an art world that is, on the one hand, oh, it's not well funded at all. So I'm not going to say that. Except that there's the auction market, which I'll never have any success in whatsoever. But
Yeah.
the art world that has some resources and has some capacity to be able to put something in front of a public. How do I
Mm.
do that without ending up stuck
Mm-hmm.
in a whole bunch of assumptions that don't interest me and a whole bunch of limitations that are constraining?
Yeah. And I feel like your work does a pretty good job with that for anyone who is familiar with your work. One thing that does seem like a common thread through what I've seen of your work or your play, as you called it, um, is that a lot of it seems to kind of question or challenge the common perceptions of time. Is that something you're really interested in? Why do you think that is?
I think everybody is. I mean, we're
Yeah.
all running late all the time. And I think that when I consider all of the different ways in which we've gotten to where we are,
Mm-hmm.
that is to say, in an industrialized society that has appropriately been referred to as the Anthropocene. Now,
Yeah.
whether that's an epoch or not remains to be seen based on our actions. And I very much hope that it is just a geological episode, that
Mm-hmm.
we are in an untenable and clearly unsustainable situation.
Right.
And I don't need to tell you that, but I can maybe say something about how I think we got there and
Mm-hmm.
what I think we might be able to do in terms of a cognitive shift that might help us to move beyond it, because
Mm-hmm.
we can't give in to this. I think that the ecological grief that is really present in our society right now,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
absolutely understandable and justified, but it is not an excuse for inaction, nor
Yeah.
do I think that we should be encouraging that mindset if we can possibly provide some sort of alternative mindset that might get us past the cause of that grief.
Yeah, totally.
So, so basically, from my perspective, which is really quite untutored, and I would say that you'd be highly irresponsible if you believe me on any of this, but I've given it a lot of thought and I'll share with you what I've thought.
Okay.
I think that time is largely responsible for this turn. And that seems
Mm-hmm.
strange to say. I mean, you would think it's a steam engine, you would think that it is the railroad, and it is all of those, but
Mm-hmm.
all of those are very much contingent on the industrialization of time.
Yeah.
Time becoming technical. Basically, when we get the ability to measure time and to coordinate action in the world on the basis of some sort of calibration that is abstract and that is accessible to all
Mm-hmm.
without any sort of reference to the planet, it means
Mm-hmm.
that you can, first of all, you can make the railroads run on time perhaps, but you can make them run in the first place because you have the ability then to coordinate action at a distance.
Mm-hmm.
But you also ultimately end up with the possibility of controlling labor. And you have the
Yep.
possibility through transportation of creating global industry and multinational corporations. So
Mm-hmm.
it is a gross oversimplification, but I think it's a useful oversimplification to say that
Yeah.
time is what is driving us forward toward oblivion. And so what might we do in terms of how we think about time as a way in which to think differently
Mm-hmm.
without turning into an Apple billboard? Let's think different. So I guess that I am not quite going to be accused of trademark infringement there, but
Yeah.
to think differently. And I
Mm-hmm.
think that this is really about recognizing the time is all around us,
Mm-hmm.
reckoned by every living being and also by all living systems,
Mm-hmm.
ranging from the small to the planetary, and that we need to tap into these alternative ways of reckoning time and the alternative time that is reckoned, or in other words, as an extension of the idea of biodiversity, we need to think about chronodiversity.
Hmm. Okay.
And that chronodiversity manifests when we start to, for instance, look at the time that is lived by a bristlecone pine tree that lives for
Mm-hmm.
5,000 years.
Yeah.
or alternatively by a mayfly, which doesn't live for 5,000 years.
Much shorter.
And so I think that it isn't just a matter of lifespan, but it's also a matter of how how each and every organism, and also a living system, and a river is a living system.
Yeah.
And a river also, there's a way in which time is measured by the river, for instance,
Mm-hmm.
by watching its meander and watching how its meander changes as a way in which to understand time through that particular perspective.
Yeah.
So, what I'm saying is so blatantly obvious as to be almost criminal. And also, what I'm saying is something that was present in all pre-industrial societies and
Yeah.
remains present in indigenous societies,
Mm-hmm.
and that needs to be recognized and acknowledged for the fact that this has been around for a long time and remains actively present. For instance, I have spent
Okay.
a little time in Alaska and had some exposure
Okay.
to Inuit ways of thinking about time through some conversations that I've had.
Okay.
And this is just one example of many, but really what I'm trying to figure out are ways in which we can recalibrate modern society
Mm-hmm.
using the apparatus that we're familiar with in a way that we are brought back into sync with nature. And we are
Mm-hmm.
not apart from nature. We
Yeah.
remain a part of nature, and we need to recognize that as much as
Right.
we have done all that we can to ignore it. So,
Mm-hmm.
partly, I think that that is really through time, we can reconfigure our society and come to the recognition of how we really are, have always been and remain a part of nature. But
Yeah.
it also becomes many other things. So what I'm looking at, for instance, is in Alaska,
Mm-hmm.
I took rivers as a basis for reckoning time.
Mm-hmm.
And so I took a cliche, and time flows, and well, rivers flow as well. So
Right.
what would happen if we were to calibrate our clocks and calendars based on the flow of our rivers and to
Mm-hmm.
localize it? So the local river, as it flows more quickly in one season, more slowly in another, that actually changes the rate at which time is passing according to the municipal clock. So
Mm.
you might imagine a water wheel that you place in the river. The water wheel is scaled to spin at 1 RPM,
Yeah.
given the current average annual flow. Well, it's going
Mm-hmm.
to flow more quickly in some seasons, more slowly in others. It also, in the case of Alaska, for instance, we're talking about glacially fed rivers. It's going to change over time.
Mm.
There's a phenomenon in glaciology, which is peak flow, where
Yeah.
basically there's going to be an acceleration in terms of flow, and then
Mm-hmm.
there's going to be a deceleration. And ultimately, there may be nothing.
Right.
So, therefore, if you take the water wheel, literally not a good idea in Alaska. So we're working with the US Geological Survey and
Okay.
using their metering.
Okay.
You do the equivalent, and you then calibrate a clock based on that flow. And then you make that manifest in a way that people in the city are seeing time in that way.
Hmm. Okay.
It leads to a certain, at least to two different ways in which to think in terms of time and to think through time in terms of our actions in the world. One of these
Mm-hmm.
is contingent, and that is to say that the seasonal flow, it fluctuates, but it also fluctuates between day and night, and it also has a certain stochastic quality. It is,
Mm-hmm.
there is a randomness in the system. Therefore, you never know quite when 2:30 tomorrow will be, and you need to be constantly aware of your surroundings.
Hmm. Okay.
And that situates you in the world, in the environment, with an attentiveness that we have largely lost. At the
Mm-hmm.
same time, we need to be thinking in the long term in terms of the consequences of our actions and to be calibrating what we're doing today in ways that will allow for a world in the future to be a world that is desirable,
Right.
or at least that we do as little harm as possible. So,
Mm-hmm.
in order to do that, I think that being able to see the impact of human activity
Mm-hmm.
in a vernacular that we all know, the vernacular of time, and being able to calibrate our actions, which clocks do, based on the speed at which this clock is running. It leads to where the clock can be thought of as sort of an environmental observatory. It leads to a
Right.
way in which to observe these changes and to react, to respond. So responsibility comes out of responsiveness, and that
Mm-hmm.
responsiveness is only possible through an attentiveness that needs to have the combination of foresight and humility. The
Mm.
foresight comes through an understanding of how actions are impacting change in aggregate.
Mm-hmm.
Humility comes from the not knowing and the awareness of not knowing and the contingency in the moment. And so
Right.
while these seem to be contradictory, they both can be built into this sort of clock. So what I'm really trying to do is I'm trying to figure out, how do we access in ways that fit into our world today
Yeah.
what we've always known and what we still know and what is more essential to us now than it has ever been, because our actions today can have such extraordinarily profound impact on the
Yeah.
environment
Totally.
at any moment.
Yeah. No, I really love this concept of using rivers as a timekeeping device, because that is such a huge problem. Like you were saying, the industrialization of time, or maybe like the commodification of time, is that we today, especially when I feel like we are guilty of such short-term thinking, we really have lost a lot of our ability to think in long term. But I mean, I was reading this book last year, The Overstory by Richard Powers, which I'm not sure if you've read or not. But he talks like the whole point of that book is just the need for humans to think in long term and think at the speed of trees, I think is the way that he put it. Which is something that I've kind of been wrestling with since I read that. Is like, how do you get people to shift their thinking in that way without really being able to see it? And I think something like your river time project can help with that, because it is giving people more of a visual, I guess. It's giving them something a little bit more tangible.
I hope so.
Yeah.
And I think that it can operate in all sorts of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So just to bring up trees for a moment, I've been working for a while now with the Long Now Foundation and the Nevada Museum of Art
Yeah.
on bristlecone pine trees,
Mm-hmm.
where what the idea there is to start with a calendar as the concept. So,
Mm-hmm.
as we all know, a tree grows a ring every year.
Right.
And what's most interesting about that is that the thickness varies based on environmental conditions.
Right.
So you have a whole field of research, dendrochronology, that is
Mm-hmm.
dedicated to understanding that, and archaeology actually uses it in order to be able to date an
Yeah.
old house, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
So the proposition that I've been working with is that we can look to a bristlecone pine tree, a tree that will live potentially for 5,000 years, maybe even longer,
Right.
as a very long-term calendar that can, again, as with the rivers, can calibrate us in terms of our actions. So the basic idea
Mm-hmm.
is, imagine a sapling and take the average annual growth for bristlecone pine trees right now. It's
Mm-hmm.
about 1 millimeter per year.
Yeah.
And extrapolate out 5,000 years, place stone markers, for instance, in the
Mm-hmm.
landscape in a spiral around the tree. For each marker, engrave or incise a date
Mm.
where you are calculating using the Gregorian calendar, standard dates, you're
Mm-hmm.
going forward 5,000 years.
Hmm.
And you have them regularly spaced based on that 1 millimeter per year rule. That is, in fact, not a rule because it will vary. And so, envisioning that we continue to put more carbon into the atmosphere,
Yeah.
the result is an acceleration in growth for the tree. So,
Mm-hmm.
in other words, based on an estimation we could maybe make at this stage in history,
Mm-hmm.
the tree is going to end up well ahead of the Gregorian calendar.
Hmm.
And it's something that is, of course, inaccessible
Yeah.
to most because bristlecone pine trees grow in places that are highly inaccessible. So what
Yeah.
we're working on right now is on Mount Washington in eastern Nevada,
Okay.
where the Long Now Foundation has a property with bristlecone pine trees. So we're looking to do this there, to build these
Mm.
calendars around some trees there. But the idea is equally to make this something that is present in
Mm-hmm.
the city. So that has been my work with the Nevada Museum of Art, where,
Okay.
for instance, one way in which to approach this would be to take the measure of the tree using a dendrometer, which is a device that you can wrap around a tree and it will tell you in microns
Hmm.
what the tree is doing, how quickly the tree is growing.
Hmm.
So you might
Okay.
imagine that that is used as a basis for a new time protocol. In the same way that I was doing so with rivers, to
Yeah.
have a time protocol that is calibrated by the tree, where the tree has authority. So basically, in the case of the spiral of stones, the tree might end up well ahead, but the what I'm challenging people to do is to say that this tree has authority in this place. And in
Mm-hmm.
fact, this is the year right here, right now. And we need to accept that chronodiversity, which also manifests in terms of place and
Yeah.
diversity of different times and different places. So a sort of spatiotemporal diversity that manifests from it, but
Mm-hmm.
also to transport that into people's lives by, for instance, I'm working with Earth Law Center on legislation that would mandate as a legal time standard the time that is kept by the trees, or in the case of Atlanta, where I've been working most recently on the River Time Initiative for the Chattahoochee River, where the Chattahoochee would provide alternative time standard for Atlanta. But then it also is a matter of how you make this accessible in people's lives. And I think that part of this is a matter of building a clock, municipal clock. And so in the case of Alaska, we did this as a projection on the museum, the Anchorage Museum, which was the museum that sponsored the project. In the case of Atlanta, we're looking actually to build in downtown Atlanta a physical clock that would be calibrated by the Chattahoochee. But then
Hmm.
you can also bring it into people's lives in other ways. You can do
Yeah.
so through, for instance, a smartwatch app or
Yeah.
scheduling software. So you can also have experiential means. For instance, in Alaska, we set a metronome
Oh,
that
okay.
was operating at the rate of, and in the case of Alaska, we had 5 different rivers, and each one of them, there's a mean Alaska mean river time, and each one of
Hmm.
these rivers kept time on its own. And so what we
Okay.
did, we had a a string quartet, a chamber orchestra.
I was actually going to ask about that. Yeah.
So they performed to the metronome
Okay. Cool.
for different rivers at the time that they performed.
Hmm.
And of course, something like Vivaldi's Four Seasons, which is very familiar and
Yeah.
also appropriate in a way, that was
Yeah.
really interesting. But it also is interesting to think about, okay, so what gets composed for this? And that really is, I think, where in the case of Georgia, one thing that we're
Hmm.
looking at is to work with composers. So basically what happens is that you bring this into people's lives in a way that they can experience these alternatives. And this
Yeah.
is where I think what I was talking about earlier with alternative realities and the thought experiment, in a
Hmm.
sense, all of this is one way you can think about this is that I'm building observatories. And these are
Right.
observatories that are public observatories that are open to anybody and everyone. And I'm trying to bring science back into natural philosophy, where natural philosophy was something that was for amateurs, where anybody could do it. But I'm also, I think, thinking about it in terms of experimental philosophy, thinking about it in terms of bringing it into the realm of the thought experiment and saying, what if we were to live on this local time kept by this river that
Mm-hmm.
is the river that runs through our town or our city?
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there are a lot of reasons why that could be a really bad idea. And there are a lot of
Sure.
things that could fall apart as a result of it.
Mm-hmm.
There are a lot of lives that might be made more miserable. There's a lot of suffering that could happen. So I'm not saying that we
Hmm.
should do that, giving it absolute authority right here, right now. But I'm saying that we need to be thinking about alternative ways in which to time our lives in order to
Yeah.
be able to figure out how to live our lives collectively toward an environmental justice that is in sync with social justice.
Mm-hmm.
All of this can work in tandem because you can't
Yeah.
have one without the other. You can't
Exactly.
have a world in which any of us are going to want to live, let alone all of the other species that are being killed off by the sixth mass extinction.
Mm-hmm.
We can't have that unless we put it all together.
Right.
So part of what I'm doing also is I'm saying that time is something that affects everyone and everything. And while it is only one part of the totality of our world, it
Mm.
is a connective part of our world. It is something that
Yeah.
connects all parts of our world and connects all parts of our world to all other parts.
Mm-hmm. I think that's great. It makes me think of I believe it's in Times Square now, if I'm not mistaken, but I think that there's like a carbon counter in Times Square. Are
Yeah,
you
the
familiar with
climate.
this? Or the
Yes.
climate clock? Yeah, that's what it is.
Okay, so I'm gonna try to be, would never really want to try to be nice, but I'm going to try to look at this in terms of what I think is beneficial about it, but
Mm,
I'm also not going to give it a free pass.
sure.
What is beneficial about it is what was beneficial and remains beneficial about the doomsday clock that has been maintained
Yeah.
by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists since the 1940s. There
Yeah.
is a real value in some sort of a public measure of imminent existential risk.
Right.
And there's real value in that being very direct
Mm-hmm.
and very easily understandable. In the same way that the warming stripes that were featured on the cover of The Economist, this way in which to
Yeah.
visualize warming trends, just as far as simplification goes, a climate scientist isn't going to be able to do anything with it, but it can motivate the public, and that
Mm-hmm.
is really important. We're in a state of triage right now,
Sure.
and we need to be thinking in terms of triage, but we also need to be thinking beyond triage, because if we continue to think just in terms of triage, we're never going to get past it. So where I object to the climate clock
Yeah.
in terms of that being all that there is,
Mm-hmm.
or that being what we're really focusing on, is that I think that it doesn't open conversation,
Yeah.
but rather directs decision,
Action. Yeah. Okay.
directs action. We definitely need to be directed. Activism is really important right now,
Mm-hmm.
and it is a mechanism for activism.
Right.
But as important as activism is thoughtfulness,
Right.
is an ability to understand, and especially a capacity for what is sometimes referred to as intellectual humility.
Hmm.
I think that we need equally to develop that capacity, first, for a number of reasons. So one reason is I think that a mechanism such as the climate clock or the warming stripes,
Mm-hmm.
that these bring too great a sense of certainty,
Yeah.
and that they,
Yeah.
in their
Totally.
oversimplification, they short circuit the uncertainties that we need to be aware of
Yeah.
in order to really understand the complexity of the problem. But
Mm,
more important than that, it makes it doesn't it doesn't work ultimately within the context of a democracy of
right.
collective self-determination. We need the capacity to think, and we need to be prompted in ways, activated in ways to think collectively, to think
Mm,
in a way that only philosophy, and I'm not talking about Western philosophy or Eastern philosophy. I'm not talking about philosophy in academia versus outside of academia, but philosophy just in terms of love of knowledge,
mm-hmm.
that sort of that impulse. I
Yeah.
think that that is where we need to be going, and that
Mm-hmm.
needs all ready to be present at the same time that we can have our climate clock and we can have our doomsday clock and we can have our warming stripes and all the rest.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. Yeah, it's I see the value, like you were saying, in the climate clock, but it does seem to kind of be ignoring the underlying problem, which I feel like is what the River Time project gets at, which, as we were saying earlier, again, is like the commodification or the industrialization of time. So, I mean, like, we always think in terms of ticking clocks of like running out of time. And like, especially in the United States, like, we're very driven by schedules and we like to be very punctual. But I feel like just putting like a concrete number on it like that, like we have exactly, 10 years to save the planet or whatever the messaging is, like that is an oversimplification in many ways. And I think what the River Time project does is that it gets people just to think differently about time. And part of that is, being more in tune with the so-called natural world, even though we're part of the natural world. But in a
Yeah.
huge way, I think we've lost that sense, and that seems to kind of be emblematic in things like the climate clock. So it's interesting.
Well, I think that it's also it's very interesting. As I'm sure that, as I'm sure you've seen,
Mm-hmm.
there's just in the past few days a report that has come out from the United Nations
Mm-hmm.
that finally the people studying climate and the people studying biodiversity
Oh, yeah.
realize that, oh, actually,
These are
we're
connected.
talking about the same problem exactly.
Yeah.
So
Wow. Weird.
I am, I think I was flabbergasted by that, even though I knew that that was the case because these conversations I've I've been hearing this, and one of the conversations I've been having with Earth Law Center, where I'm really trying to develop a lot of these at a conceptual level, and
Mm,
also a lot of these ideas I'm trying to develop at the level of how we can bring about real world action in terms
yeah.
of rethinking jurisprudence, rethinking
Mm-hmm.
legal systems and legislation. But one of the conversations
Yeah.
that we've been having has been around funding. I
Mm,
mean, inevitably, that's what happens when you're an NGO and trying to figure out how do you get, in their case, their focus comes from rights of nature, but
mm-hmm.
is more broadly earth law,
Sure.
which is to say that it is very much about living systems.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of funding for climate change.
Yeah.
Well, a lot of funding for climate change as far as funding to try to change the climate, which is funding going
Sure.
to Chevron, but
Mm-hmm.
maybe not Exxon so much anymore. We'll see about that. But
God.
there's also the there's a way in which climate change seems to have captured the public imagination, and in particular been relatively, I don't know whether it's been safe territory, but for some reason, it seems like a lot of the philanthropy has been going into climate change, but in a way that, or addressing climate change, but in a way that has been ignoring all of the interconnectivity. And so,
Yeah.
climate clock
Like
feels to me like,
geoengineering.
yeah, well, like geoengineering, like just saying that we're trying to address the environment and
Mm,
environmental problems with alternative energy. So,
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm happy to get into the question of geoengineering with you, but I think we can be
Sure.
even much more banal here and say, okay, the Biden administration
Mm-hmm.
is generally well-meaning in terms of recognizing there's environmental devastation and
Yeah.
something needs to be done about it.
Mm-hmm.
But for the most part, the response is let's make more wind farms. And
Yeah.
that is not going to do it. That
Mm.
is going
Yep.
to help to some extent with also some hindrance. And I think that one of the great things about this UN report is that at least it starts a conversation in a very public way that has been happening in back rooms for a long time to do with
Yeah.
what are the relative gains and losses when you start to look at loss to biodiversity in an effort to, for instance, make more pellets for pellet stoves
Yeah.
and all of these really complex trade-offs. We need to be talking about those.
Mm-hmm.
But I think that just the fact that for the most part, when you look at a relatively well-meaning US government, or at least saintly by comparison to the one that came previously,
Yeah.
you're still talking about something that is really short-sighted, I think, and
Yeah, I
really
agree.
narrow-minded.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it it kind of just is getting at the whole problem of like the system is broken, not like the way that we run the system is broken necessarily. I mean, like I will have people like my mom, for instance, ask me like, so like, what do we need to do? Like, do I need to should like more people drive electric cars? I'm like, more people should just not have cars. Like, that's really like more of the problem are things like that. You know, it's not like building more wind farms is not going to save the world. um, Doing one thing, period, can't save the world, so to speak, which is kind of a weird expression in itself. But
Yes.
yeah, it is. It is really weird. But I mean, yeah, I mean, I think it just, like looking at all these things really just lays bare kind of how just entirely unsustainable modern life is. Um,
And
yeah.
that's so a lot of the work I'm doing with Earth Law Center really is about how do we go past climate change as
Mm-hmm.
basically if we are able to address that, then all problems are solved. How do
Right.
we even go past rights of nature
Mm-hmm.
and past the implicit appeal to biodiversity
Mm-hmm.
that you find within a rights of nature
Yeah.
philosophy to the implications? And those implications are, like everything, systemic.
Yeah.
So right now I'm starting to work on a project with a number of partners, but in particular, right now working with University of Southern California on
Mm-hmm.
a first stage of this, where the the proposition is that we need to enfranchise other species in democratic decision making
Yeah, totally.
because all life ultimately is implicated in the decisions that get made,
Mm-hmm.
and also because other life has access to other stimuli, or in other words, the perceptual range when we start to look at all life on Earth, as
Mm-hmm.
well as the, I'll use the word cognitive as shorthand here,
Right.
but or the word intelligence as shorthand, but
Mm-hmm.
the ability to process what is knowable through different modes of perception,
Mm-hmm.
the perception itself and the processing of what is perceived. This is really essential in terms of how we can solve or address even the biggest problems of our time, which are these
Mm-hmm.
incredibly complex systemic questions. So basically, enfranchising other species is right
Yeah.
as a matter of recognizing that we're not special, that we are not
Mm-hmm.
separate from nature. And
Right.
not only is it right, but it just also happens to be what we need in order to be able to make decisions that are good decisions for us. And
Mm-hmm.
so in order to enfranchise other species, well, it isn't easy and it isn't obvious how to do that.
Yeah.
In the United States, we have this constitution that is a couple hundred years old, and there are certain aspects that really would make that difficult, though there are other places, and we're already starting a conversation, for instance, in Chile, which is
Yeah.
currently
Yeah.
they're writing their constitution. So
Mm-hmm.
there's a lot of opportunity there. But there are ways in which, in the shorter term, to take these ideas and bring about real world action. So in the
Mm-hmm.
longer term, the basic idea that I've been working with is that we can understand what we're doing when we go to the polls
Mm-hmm.
in a way that wouldn't require that we anthropomorphize other species and say that
Yeah.
you can take your cat to the polls. Wouldn't that be adorable? But we can actually have something meaningful happen. So
Mm.
one really, again, an oversimplification as a starting point, but this oversimplification that I've been working with as a starting point is that basically what we are doing is we are responding to conditions, to the environment,
Mm-hmm.
in a way that we can change that environment through the policy that gets made through this mechanism that is our government, and
Yeah.
that we are changing the state of the government from stasis toward change or vice versa
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the very general activity of the government and of governance, and that
Yeah.
that can be potentially a matter of whether whether our stress level is increasing or decreasing as a result of the policy as it currently stands. So in
Mm.
other words, basically democracy approximated evolution in certain ways even before evolutionary theory had been articulated, and we can
Mm.
actually then back into that again by seeing democracy as evolutionary, where we can use
Hmm.
stress measurement as a way in which to be able, not only for humans but for any other species, also to enfranchise other species in that process of democratic decision making. So
Yeah.
starting with, since we're less than 1%, starting with the majority in terms of biomass that we plant, more than
Mm-hmm.
80% by some measures, starting with plants, how would you do this? Well, plants have hormones, stress hormones, that
Yeah.
they emit in response to environmental conditions.
Oh, okay. I see what you're
Most
saying.
so, for instance, an attack by aphids
Yeah.
will result in a plant making toxins that are expensive to make, in the sense that
Mm-hmm.
that requires resources. So the plant does not want to be making those toxins all the time, but
Right.
will do so in reaction. And in order to be able to do so elsewhere within the plant, because a plant
Mm-hmm.
does not have a centralized nervous system, it seems that the most efficient way in which to do so is where the plant is being attacked by the aphids. There
Mm-hmm.
is a reaction, the production of these toxins, that happens in tandem with the production of ethylene, a gas that operates hormonally for the
Mm-hmm.
plant, where that is detectable by the plant. So the plant is basically talking to itself in a
Right.
sense, and in so doing is able to coordinate a defense.
Mm-hmm.
So this gets into a whole area of biology that I think we should probably avoid for the sake of this conversation. But
It's
as
kind of
shorthand
complicated.
for that, there is the possibility of, okay, what if we start to look at scale, at
Mm-hmm.
measurement of phytohormones? And so I've been starting to
Hmm.
develop
Okay.
with scientists to just a very first approximation how that might work,
Hmm.
as a matter of measurement of volatiles, for instance, in a forest canopy. But
Mm-hmm.
in tandem with that, to say, okay, what can we do right now?
Mm-hmm.
Well, and this is the work that I've been starting to develop with USC. What we can do right now, because we can't change the Constitution, just you and me, as nice as that might
Mm-hmm.
be, we can however, start our own Gallup, our own polling
Yeah.
service. And it can be a polling service where we are polling the political position of other species.
Oh, okay,
And
cool.
we can do so with sophisticated equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Measuring ethylene is non-trivial. I've been working on that with a number of people, trying to figure out a way in which to make it trivial. One of the more outlandish ideas being that ethylene also is involved in the ripening of fruit,
Okay.
probably for reasons to do with how stress and ripening are related processes.
Mm-hmm.
But what if we were to take bananas and use bananas as cheap ethylene sensors? Basically, is a
Mm.
banana ripening more rapidly now in proximity to that plant than it was a couple months ago? Well, if it's
Okay.
ripening more rapidly now, then the ethylene being produced by the plant is increasing. Therefore, there's clearly a vote for change. So,
Okay.
lots of bananas. Dole is really happy. Probably some environmental devastation that goes into all of that. But just
Even more
that's part
environmental
of thinking this
devastation.
through. But really, where our thinking right now is what I've been developing with USC, and
Mm-hmm.
where I'm starting to now. So I'm a research associate at the University of Arizona at the Desert Laboratory, and
Mm-hmm.
they are particularly strong in terms of phenology, in terms of studying phenology, plant
Yeah.
phenology. So I've been looking at plant phenology as a way in which to address this. So, for instance, when a plant flowers earlier in the season
Mm-hmm.
versus later, that is a proxy measure, at least, for increase in stress. Plants,
Yeah.
whether it's causal or not, and the nature of the causality is a separate conversation, but you can, as a correlation, you can say that there's a correlation between increase in stress and earlier blooming.
Yeah.
Well, having that sort of observation at scale becomes quite feasible, and it becomes really interesting
Mm.
when you start to think about people as citizen pollsters.
Yeah.
Because what happens when you have a Gallup for plants is, first of all, you can suddenly start to publicize that, and plants can, for instance, issue political endorsements. But
Mm.
in order to really compound the effect, what I think is required is not only for the sort of visualizations, the sort of presence of the state of the stress level of plants in our lives and the interpretation of that, mapping that onto policy and policy changes in
Mm.
ways that can inform what policies we support, that also we need to reinforce this sense of awareness of the environment. And the citizen pollster can do this, meaning making everybody a citizen pollster, making it easy, making it interesting for people.
Mm.
We have this phenomenon that's referred to as plant blindness. How do we overcome
Okay.
plant blindness? That seems like it goes a long way toward starting to bring about something that's equivalent in some ways to what I'm trying to achieve through time. How
Yeah.
do we build awareness of the environment through a vernacular that we all are familiar with? Time, how can that
Mm-hmm.
make it so that we are aware of the changing flow of a river, and therefore peak flow is a phenomenon for glaciers, for instance?
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, how can we bring about a general awareness of the stress state, and therefore effectively how do we create an endocrine system for Gaia?
Yeah.
How do we get past, because hormonal levels are really largely responsible for our own internal state as individual humans.
Mm-hmm.
How do we how do we extend that out into the environment, and how do
Yeah.
we make that manifest in a way that people are affected by it? There's a phenomenon known as xenohormesis that's really interesting, which is
Mm-hmm.
when some species are able to detect changes in stress hormones of others and are able
Yeah.
to respond on that basis. How do we, as humans, discover or maybe rediscover our capacity for xenohormesis? How do
Mm-hmm.
we how do we build a system, ultimately rebuild the whole thing? But as a starting point for what we can do right now, how do we build the awareness that leads to policy that actually is enlisting the full intelligence of the environment and also that is building the respect for other species and living systems that can lead to the political will to make those bigger commitments to change.
Yeah. Yeah, all very important things to think about. And it makes me think of U.S. poet laureate, actually, Joy Harjo. She's got, I think her latest poetry collection is An American Sunrise, but there's a poem in there that I really like called Tobacco Origin Story.
Mhm.
And she talks a lot in it about how we've forgotten how to hear the songs of plants. And that's like a really common referent in that poem. And it sounds a lot like what you're talking about with learning how to, I guess, kind of measure stress hormones in plants. It's almost like how to talk to plants or how to listen to plants. And you said, like, how do we like learn or perhaps relearn how to do that? I feel like, especially among like what I've read about a lot of indigenous cultures, it seems like a lot of indigenous cultures do kind of have a sense for that to some degree, in some way, maybe not in like as exact with scientific terms as what we're talking about here, but um, there does seem to be like a lot more intuition there.
I
Um,
would say that
and
it actually is, in terms of, if we're going to talk about science in terms of a method that goes back to Roger Bacon,
yeah.
then we can find differences. But if we're going to talk about science in terms of predictive capacity and
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what science does in terms of
Sure. Okay.
ecology, it is really remarkable. And so you have right now, for instance, the Karuk tribe
Mm-hmm.
here in Northern California has been doing extraordinary work on what is deep knowledge within the tribe,
Mm-hmm.
putting it down on paper as a way in which to be able to. So certainly fire management is one
Okay. I
of
was
the
about to ask
obvious
if that
ways
was
in which
it.
this is happening, but in all ways that you can imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And so this idea that ecology has of indicator species is
Yeah.
something that the Karuk have as a matter of practice going back unbroken
Mm-hmm.
over millennia. And
Yeah.
so there's now a really interesting collaboration taking place, for instance, where they are working within and with universities to
Mm-hmm.
try to expand this and also to make it more accessible to more people. But I think
Right.
that what Joy Harjo is doing, and her poetry is truly extraordinary,
It is. Yeah.
is it's equally important what she is doing, because she is doing this work in a way that is making it intuitive. It
Mm-hmm.
is so within ecology you have, for instance, the principle of kin-centric ecology, which
Okay.
is in comes from indigenous systems and has gained some traction,
Mm-hmm.
though not nearly enough, very little within mainstream ecology, in other
Mm-hmm.
words, within the university system. But basically, it's a lot of what you, at least you hear echoes of in Joy Harjo's poetry, is
Yeah.
a sense of these other beings are our kin,
Mm.
and we are in a familial relationship,
Yeah.
which has to do with how you tend the land, but
Mm-hmm.
also has a lot to do with how you understand the landscape and
Yeah.
how you understand yourself within it.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't want to try to talk over her,
Sure.
because her poetry does this far better than I'm able to do in terms of my attempt at putting together a bunch of different thoughts in a rather extemporaneous and somewhat sloppy way.
Sure.
But I do think that reading the report that has recently been issued by the Cairo, reading Joy Harjo's poetry,
Mm-hmm.
these are ways into a lot of the sort of thinking. And Enrique Salmon is the name of the author of the first academic paper that I'm aware of
Okay.
to extensively and comprehensively address kincentric ecology. And he's an indigenous scholar who
Mm-hmm.
has really, this was maybe about 20 years ago, but he really
Oh, okay.
did some important work in terms of making that knowledge and that worldview accessible
Mm.
to a scientific mindset.
Yeah.
And I think that conversation is a conversation that really needs to be taking place.
Yeah, I agree. I'm reading another book right now, Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer, and that's a lot of what the book is, I think. I mean, she is a scientist. I don't know the technical term for it, but she studies moss essentially. But a lot of the book is just about indigenous wisdom and indigenous ways of doing things, and the ways that science kind of weaves into that, or I guess Western science is what I'm talking about. But um, yeah, it's funny how you said like maybe there's like two different ways of thinking about science in terms of like if we're going back to strict like textbook definition perhaps, or maybe if we're thinking about science as a capacity for being able to predict things. Um, there was one of the chapters I just read is all about a study that one of her students did studying different ways of harvesting sweetgrass. And when she presented this to the thesis committee, they kind of scoffed and they were like, well, of course, like harvesting any kind of like plant matter from nature is going to harm an ecosystem. Like this seems like a stupid study to do, basically. Like this isn't really going to contribute anything to the body of scientific knowledge. But what she found after she did the study, after she convinced them to give her permission, is that actually harvesting the sweetgrass in the ways that these indigenous communities in upstate New York were doing actually contributes to the ecosystem's flourishing. And when you don't harvest it, it actually withers and it goes away.
and
Sorry.
and is really,
Yeah.
I, I'm I just can't understand how this is difficult for people to understand,
I
but I
know.
do
Yeah.
understand. And the reason is going right back to where we were earlier in the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
The reason, most fundamental reason, well, okay, so we can talk about colonialism, we can talk about politically speaking,
Right.
and the delegitimizing of other ways of knowing, traditional
Mm-hmm.
ecological knowledge, all of that. Okay, so that's definitely one conversation that's important to have, but also it is this idea of humans being separate from nature,
Yeah. Yeah.
that
Yeah.
that fiction. So if you understand that the sweetgrass didn't evolve on its own, separate
Right.
of the humans who had been who had been in a symbiotic relationship with it over that long a span of time,
Like thousands of
but
years. Yeah.
rather that it was a coevolutionary process, then it becomes
Totally.
absolutely obvious that
Mm-hmm.
there needs to be that connection needs to be sustained.
Right. And that was a big point of what she was trying to get at, is that, I mean, like she was just saying it was so telling, like seeing the committee's reaction to her proposal for the study, because, they said like, of course, if you harvest it, it's going to harm it. She was like, it's just, such a prime example of humans thinking that like we're somehow separate from nature or above it in some way. When really like, we talk about things like environmental restoration. People will talk about like buffalo, for instance,
Mhm.
out in the plains, and how actually reintroducing buffalo and like restoring that population actually is good for the grasslands, and it actually contributes to a thriving ecosystem. She's like, but we don't ever think of that with humans. Like a lot of people, especially like simply speaking, like a Western industrialized kind of society, we can only imagine us having like a destructive relationship with nature. And this, the study that the student did kind of turns that all on its head, which I thought was just so interesting.
And we weren't thinking about that with buffalo long ago either. I mean, that's
Right.
even
Yeah.
really. a relatively new way of
Mm-hmm.
thinking that's again a very old way of thinking. And
Right.
this process of resurfacing, or really of just of listening.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
It's kind of science vaunts observation, and yet the kinds of observation that are methodologically habitual or even
Mm-hmm.
permissible within the sciences often leave out a lot of what might be observed and who might be observed and whose observations
Yeah.
count in terms of what makes knowledge. And I
Exactly.
I've been particularly interested recently in how we can expand ecology to include other species.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that there is a tendency for us to think that we are studying the environment, that we're studying these other species, and that's what ecologists do.
Hmm.
But I think that it is absolutely valid and actually really important to recognize that these other species also are ecologists, and that they are studying the environment in which they live as well,
Hmm.
and that their ability to do so and to do so well is actually has been essential to their survival,
Hmm.
and that their way of their ways of sensing and their ways of processing what they sense, and this is at a sort of a micro scale, perhaps what I'm getting at when I talk about democracy involving all species. I
Yeah.
think that level of doing science, that thinking about the plant that you would typically say, I'm studying that plant. Well, no,
Hmm.
that plant is actually should be a co-PI, a co-investigator. And
Yeah.
we should think about how we can, in terms of our publication, co-publish with other species and with living systems.
Hmm.
And that also then means how do we how do we create a an open system in terms of our publication? There's been some begrudging movement on the part of the scientific journals toward opening publications such that
Yeah.
you don't have to spend $10,000 in order to have the privilege to
Very
read
expensive.
a paper that was published based on funds that came, I'd say it, from taxpayer dollars, but it
Right.
did.
Yeah.
But how do we think about opening up the process such that other species also can access the results of the research
Hmm.
that they participated in? In other words, what sorts of language actually would not preclude, and what sorts of manifestation of these results from research would not preclude other species from benefiting from them? Because if you think about it, we're
Hmm.
benefiting greatly from what that plant is sensing. Taking, for instance, just as a really easy example here,
Mm-hmm.
an indicator species. So an ecologist studies an indicator species that is indicative in terms of what you can observe about it, indicative of larger changes in the environment.
Mm-hmm.
But in fact, the that plant, that indicator species, is not just observed; it also is an observer.
Okay.
And it is an observer in the sense that it is also a scientist. It is also an ecologist, and therefore is contributing intellectually to the research
Hmm.
as well. So if we recognize that, then first of all, it's the beginning of getting away from our hubris and the beginning of
Yeah.
getting out of this sort of us versus them way of thinking of the world. But
Yeah.
also, that indicator species would perhaps benefit from the knowledge that it is helping to generate in a way that is in relation to what we're doing
Yeah.
as as scientists. So if we're co-investigators, we should be sharing our results.
Mm-hmm.
And this results potentially in a new way of doing science that actually turns into a new level of symbiosis. And that new level of
Hmm.
symbiosis can potentially be symbiosis at a rate that can accommodate climate change and a changing environment. Because the thing is
Yeah.
that evolutionary processes, if you're a bacterium, you're in relatively good shape. Horizontal gene transfer, which is, I think, actually a really good model for rethinking
Sure.
intellectual property law, but that's another matter.
Yeah.
I think that when we're looking at most species, their rate of evolution is far slower than the rate of change in the world right now and
Yeah.
in times, because industrialization occupies such a short span of time relative to the time that their evolutionary processes in their own right, that those processes evolve.
Mm-hmm.
So we therefore need to think about what are some of the other ways in which adaptation takes place. And
Okay.
one of those
Interesting.
is you go to Monsanto. Another one
Yeah.
is that you think about symbiosis.
Mm-hmm.
Symbiosis is, in fact, kind of a rapid prototyping in
Yeah.
nature
Totally.
of adaptation. So, therefore, if we start thinking about symbiosis with humans in the symbiotic equation,
Mm-hmm.
and if we think about one of the symbiotic activities being the activity of symbiotic science, science
Yeah.
as a form of symbiosis, that can be potentially profound.
Yeah. That would be huge. I think if we were able to do that.
Well, I don't think
Um.
that's so hard. I mean, so I'm
Yeah.
working right now with Antennae, with a journal
Mm-hmm.
that is an art and ecology journal, starting to
Okay.
prototype what would a scientific journal look like that was a journal that was accessible to other life forms and other living systems.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that one way to think about that is in terms of how life and living systems are already not only doing science in terms of the observational aspect,
Mm-hmm.
but also doing science in terms of the publication.
Yeah.
And here, if you look at the way in which, for instance, a river inscribes its history in the land in
Mm-hmm.
terms of the meander,
Yeah.
that
Right.
in effect is a sort of publication, and that
Yeah. Yeah.
publication is in effect a way in which the river is able to learn
Mm-hmm.
from its own past. So what if we start to think about publication in the land instead of on paper?
Mm-hmm.
What if we have a scientific journal where we have an atlas, and the atlas has the abstracts for bringing you out to these landscapes where, in fact, the science is taking place and where the science is being published, co-published by us with other species. So
Mm.
this is a new way in which to think about scientific publication that can
Yeah.
be a leading into a new way of doing science that can then get us past certain particular. So I mean, the human mind obviously evolved in very specific conditions,
Yeah.
and there are heuristics that were very good for those conditions that don't necessarily work in conditions where we currently live, and certainly in the conditions that we have created. So
Right.
potentially only if we have this sort of broadening of epistemology, or
Mm-hmm.
or a sort of epistemic diversity that goes
Yeah.
along with biodiversity, only then do we have any chance of being able to get past these sort of evolved blind spots and to be able to generate knowledge at the rate of, because of the symbiosis, but also at the intelligence of the environment itself. The whole
Mm-hmm.
ecosystem can evolve in ways that is generating its own knowledge and that is acting on it, in which we are fully integrated into it. And that gets us into a rather different system than we're living in today.
Yeah. Do you think that going back to the River Time project a little bit, do you see that I guess creating a clock based on the flow and meander of a river, is that a form of publication you would say?
Yeah,
It seems like kind of a form of communicating back and forth.
absolutely. It's a form
Yeah.
of So by all means, the river is engaged in some sort of publication.
Sure.
However, that publication is a publication or a broadcast, perhaps,
Yeah.
that for which we are the recipients.
Right.
Clearly, it needs to go beyond that. Clearly, there needs to be cross communication and there needs to be
Mm,
a genuine sharing, and that sharing potentially becomes between rivers and trees. They already are doing so
yeah.
within within a small radius, because a riparian system basically is doing something along those lines.
Mm,
However, we're looking at, through globalization,
yeah.
we're looking at an environment where a decision made here has an effect on another continent.
Yeah.
So how does publication, where every species is constantly publishing within an ecosystem, where the ecosystem is at a scale of change that these species evolved in,
Mm-hmm.
how do we then go from that to this expanded ecosystem that humans have created that all other species are ultimately implicated in?
Yeah. That's another huge thing. I read somewhere recently that this was talking about plastic, but the author said that every day people make, 1,000-year decisions. We don't even really think about it that much, but I mean, if you go to Starbucks, for instance, and get like your iced coffee or whatever, it comes in a plastic cup. And since 90% of plastic is never recycled, and on top of that, like, what good does recycling plastic really do anyway? um I mean, that's not really going to decompose for thousands of years if it ever does, since plastic tends to just break down into smaller particles. But that's just such a huge disconnect that we have. And I mean, a huge part of that is just that we have these systems in place that don't give us a lot of choices and like what we can do with that. But I mean, that's a massive issue, is that we have such huge impacts on the environment through seemingly harmless actions. And thinking too, there was I saw, I think on Instagram of all places, actually, there was there's this organization in Nashville. I used to live in Nashville, Tennessee, called Tennessee River Keeper. And they shared a visualization. It was, I guess, a website you could go to where you could see like like how long it takes water from Tennessee, like what impact that has on the, I guess, overall watershed. Like if you put pollutants into a river in Tennessee, where does that end up, in a couple weeks or whatever? And it was showing, like how dumping huge amounts of fertilizer into like water systems, which we're doing at an alarming rate, is creating this huge dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. Which I think is, another kind of thing that might be up your alley in terms of what you're doing with the Rivertime project. But yeah, I don't know. Just made me think of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's really important to recognize the implications of our actions
Yeah.
that may be beyond our evolved capacity
Mm-hmm.
to understand in our own heads.
Yeah.
However, I would say that when we start to think about extended cognition,
Mm-hmm.
that is to say, when we think about cognition as being something that is not only in our heads, but also is out in the world,
Yeah.
and that it also involves, it's distributed and it also involves others,
Mm-hmm.
that we can start to really enact that as a basis for being able to understand what we're doing.
Mm.
And that requires a very different sort of, a different set of hierarchical foundations, I guess, in terms of the hierarchy of our head and what happens inside our head, and ultimately what happens literally and figuratively downriver. How do
Yeah.
we start to think about what's happening downriver as being part of our distributed cognition?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we think about the collective cognition that is manifested, for instance, in schools of fish in terms
Mm-hmm.
of their behavior? How do we enter into it? How do we how do we create a trans-species collective cognition
Yeah.
that is intentional and that is constantly manifested in terms of the decisions that we make. I think that
Mm.
when we take this idea of embodied cognition and we take this extended cognition, we take this global view of it, and we
Mm-hmm.
start to then feed it back into our decision making, that we might be able to make decisions at the scale of the consequences of
Mm.
our actions.
Yeah. That makes me curious. I mean, I feel like we've been talking about how we can learn from the publications, so to speak, of nature. Um, that kind of makes me wonder how we might then, I guess, enter into communication with nature, as it were. In
I think we
response to
already are.
that, do you get what
I,
I'm asking?
I mean, we certainly are already. I think that we're
Yeah.
actually sending a lot of we're sending a lot of signals inadvertently, unintentionally,
Yeah.
that natural systems are very attentive to. Often, the signal is sufficient to kill them,
Mm.
which is a problem.
Yeah.
But also, I think that there's a lot that we may not think that we're disclosing that we are.
Mhm.
But there is, I think, more generally, if you start to understand or start to think about cognition in this distributed way,
Mhm.
then the cognitive system of planet Earth itself involves all of those pathways and all of the transportation of different chemicals and the effects that that has and the effects of those effects.
Mhm.
And to be able to in any way grapple with that, of course, within one's own head is difficult to say the least, and quite possibly
Yeah.
impossible. And the impossibility of it leads us back, I think, to intellectual humility as being really an essential attribute that we need to cultivate.
Mhm.
But we can certainly also just take any given instance of it, recognizing that we're being reductionist. I think that there's great
Yeah.
value in I think there's great value in committing various sins of the sort that reductionism is,
Yeah.
where you do
Okay.
so intentionally, in the same way that apophenia, for instance.
Mhm.
So the recognition of a pattern of a signal in noise, or the the the, the mistaken detection of a signal in noise. So
Mhm.
astrology is a classic example of this, where you're taking what you're seeing in the stars and you are extrapolating from that some sort of
Right.
predictive value. And it is possible, and I'm agnostic on all things, including astrology. It is possible
Sure.
that this is valid, and this is valid for reasons to do with one or more gods that are somehow involved in it. I don't know.
Sure.
I have no way of knowing.
Mhm.
But apophenia is rightly denigrated for the fact that it can lead to some very poor decisions and can
Mhm.
lead to some certainties that are unwarranted. But
Yeah.
what I refer to as applied apophenia actually can be very valuable. That is to say that when we recognize that that's what we're doing, when we do it intentionally, and when we do it in order to be able to open up the possibility space, and here I'm getting back to experimental philosophy as a practice. I'm getting back to how do we
Sure.
generate hypotheses that we then can experiment on.
Mhm.
Generating hypotheses is it isn't easy to think of counterfactuals that are really deep counterfactuals.
Mhm.
And one way in which to do so is serendipitously, or to do so through a, a detection, well, through seeing it in the stars, or through seeing it in the tea leaves. The
Yeah.
randomness can actually lead to a false recognition that can be used as a basis then for a real experiment. And
Sure.
so I'm advocating also reductionism in an equivalent way, that it can be helpful to us as long
Mm.
as we recognize that we're being reductionist. But to bring this back around to time,
Yeah.
I'm particularly interested in a lot of these questions to do with fertilizers which is where you came from as far as this was concerned,
Sure.
because of the fact that there is a way, once again, to think about that in terms of time. And
Mhm.
again, to be reductionist intentionally and to acknowledge that reductionism here, but to say then, okay, so what's going on? Amongst other things, one that I think is really pertinent is that fertilizer is partly comprehensible
Mhm.
in terms of time. Effectively, artificial fertilizers are accelerating
Mhm.
certain processes, growth processes in plants.
Right.
They're in various ways accelerating aspects of the ecosystem, and often accelerating them to the point that they exhaust themselves,
Yeah.
because that is something that is not really evolved in a way that can sustain itself.
Mhm.
So I think that we therefore need to look at that problem in terms of time itself, and in
Okay.
terms of how we understand time in relation to natural systems and the abuse of various other life forms and living systems
Mhm.
that happens through various materials, various activities, but that can be construed through time. And
Sure.
that thinking about in terms of rights of nature,
Mhm.
putting that framework on it, what would it mean to say that there's a right of nature to live at its own pace? That
Okay. Hmm.
that life has a right to live at its own pace,
Right.
and to enshrine that in law. Well, it's just folksy enough that I can almost hear Joe Biden saying it. It's the sort of thing that I think people can get behind, but that has really big implications, because it then reaches into all these territories, literally and figuratively. Because suddenly, when you start thinking about chronodiversity as being essential to biodiversity and vice versa, and having real value in terms of the sustainability of an ecosystem, and also just in terms of its own legitimacy, its own rights, and then you start to build on that those rights need to be recognized, then that has these policy implications that
Mhm.
lead to a change that is potentially systemic when it is applied globally and is applied with with the rigor that I'm calling for. That
Sure.
suddenly there are a lot of downriver, again, to use a appropriate metaphor here, perhaps,
Sure.
downriver effects. So, and those are effects that don't necessarily seem present when you start with the proposition that I
Mhm.
have. So, for me, coming all the way back around,
Yeah.
trying to bring you to a natural ending here, for me,
You're
one
fine.
of the ways in which the projects in relation to time have been
Mhm.
so interesting,
Yeah.
they are thought experiments, but they are
Mhm.
thought experiments that also, in addition to the specific conditions that I am experimenting with,
Mhm.
that at that broader level lead to other thought experiments
Mhm.
that are well outside of what you think about when you think about clocks and time,
Sure.
and that ultimately activate thought experimentation as a mode of being in the world
Mhm.
that perhaps has the potential, the capacity to bring us to a systemic change that is at the scale that you've been alluding to earlier, that
Sure.
goes well beyond simply deciding whether to have an iced coffee or not, or whether to vote for the Republicans or the Democrats this cycle.
Right.
So I think that we need that to bring about that sort of thought experimentation, we all need to
Mhm.
become experimental philosophers. And
Mm.
where we end up as a result of making that move is in no way something that I think we can predict or even imagine right now. Because when I started working with time, it was with the redwood trees, and it was
Mm.
an invitation to go and to give a talk at the College of the Redwoods and thinking about redwood trees and their growth and thinking about what if we put a spiral of stones around it. It was just a really simple
Yeah.
gesture. And here we are. And this was 15 years ago or so. And here I
Yeah.
am still trying to bring this about in the world. But here we are having a conversation about chronodiversity and all these ideas that came
Mhm.
about just as a result of following these conversations in new directions. So
Yeah.
that is maybe where I'll leave it, is to say that we should all become experimental philosophers, and we should all have a reunion here on your podcast in order to be able to discuss our findings.
Yeah, let's do it whenever that happens.
And other species.
Yeah, yeah, we'll invite the cats and some of the trees too. Yeah. All right, cool. Well, really quick before we end, I was going to ask for anyone listening who wants to keep up with your work, where might be a good place for them to do that?
Well, that's always challenging. Google is perhaps the best.
Just
The
Google you.
the Atlanta River Time Project
Uh-huh.
is being run through Flux Projects,
Okay.
and so that would be a good way to keep up with that.
Mm-hmm.
Other projects are happening through other venues all around the world.
Okay.
So I
Just
would
Google Jonathon
say,
Keats.
and you tell me what I'm doing, because I never know what it will be tomorrow, let alone next week.
Okay, cool. Got it. Well, we'll leave it there. Jonathon, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really, really enjoyed getting to talk to you. This was great.
Thank you. Really enjoyed it as well.
Awesome.